Thank you for joining us with Avi Melamed for the second in a three-part series. Avi, one of my favorite stories over the years is about a community that was embroiled in controversy, specifically a synagogue. And this synagogue fought the membership about everything. And mostly, though, they fought about how to say Shema. And every time it came to say Shema, half of the synagogue would say it's standing up, and half would say it's sitting down, which would have been fine, two different minhagim, except that every time it came time to say Shema, both factions would start yelling and screaming at each other to the point that they could not daven anymore. They finally decided to put this machlokis, this dispute, to bed by seeing Mr. Goldberg. Goldberg was 95 years old. He was around 75 years ago when the shul was founded. And whatever they agreed, whatever Goldberg said was the minhag of the shul, the custom of the shul 75 years ago, is what they would follow. So they went to see Goldberg in the nursing home room. Faction from each side, a representative from each side, and the rabbi. And Goldberg had been in the nursing home for 10 years, hadn't picked up his head off the pillow the entire time. And they go into the nursing home room, and the standers up go first, and they explain, Goldberg, here's the situation. Wasn't it the custom of the shul 75 years ago to stand up? So Goldberg says, no, that wasn't the custom. So the sitters down are emboldened. They leap up and they say, aha, if it wasn't standing up, it must have been sitting down 75 years ago, right, Mr. Goldberg? He says, no, that wasn't the custom either. Whereupon pandemonium broke out in the nursing home room, screaming, yelling, bedpans, toilet paper flying. Goldberg shoots up in his bed for the first time in 10 years. He says, that was the custom 75 years ago. So that speaks, of course, all too often to the nature of our community, right? We tend to be pretty fractious. It's always been that way. Unfortunately, that's increasing both within the Jewish community and more broadly these days. And I tell that story, Avi, because the one issue that for at least the first 5, perhaps 6 decades of Israel's existence, that united diaspora Jewry, and specifically American Jewry, virtually united across the spectrum, was support for Israel. And now, of course, in the last decade or so, that's much more tenuous. And we see lots of evidence from that, from the Pew study, the Pew demographic study that was done in 2013, many other studies. And then we all know anecdotally in the course of our own work and in our own communities that Israel is increasingly a fractious issue, if it's a relevant issue at all. And one of the challenges is that for too many in our community, particularly on the younger side, it's no longer really a relevant factor. And that's a challenge for us as well. And these phenomena and this fractiousness within our community over Israel poses challenges, of course, to our own community, to the safety and security of our own community, particularly as anti-Semitism rises. And also, many would argue it's a strategic issue for the state of Israel as well. And so your perspective on this is critical, it's timely, and we're grateful that you're joining us to share. And so just briefly, for those of you who heard Avi 2 weeks ago talk about disengagement, you know what an incredible presenter he is. Avi is a former intelligence officer, military intelligence counterterrorism in Israel. He is the founder and CEO of Inside the Middle East, and often presents in a variety of fora on key issues facing the state of Israel. And Avi's latest book is entitled Inside the Middle East, and it helps readers make sense of regional events as they unfold. So again, with much gratitude, Avi, thank you again for joining us today.
David, thank you so much. That was the perfect presentation and framing of the whole story, so I thank you for that. And I thank you all for giving me the stage and the opportunity. I just want to thank everyone that was involved in this whole process. So with your permission, we'll just let us move on to the discussion tonight, which I hope will be significant and meaningful for you. Now, before we start, I just want to make one short comment. This is a very sensitive issue, and I want to be very respectful, and I want to emphasize one thing. The observations I'm going to share with you, the perspectives, are not about criticism, any kind of outlook or any kind of group or camp. It is rather really an attempt to provide some different outlook and approach towards this very challenging task that you, David, mentioned before. So our session, Changing the Lenses, a new framework for discussion. And like many other things that I'm doing quite often, I would like to start with a story. Shortly, a couple of years ago, I was invited to, not as a speaker, just to attend an event held in one house, a private house. It was an intergenerational discussion. The father is a well-known leader in his community, warm Zionist. The son went to university, a very prestigious university, came back from the university and actually was flipped over. The tension in the family was skyrocketing around the issue of Israel. And then at some point, the father and the son had this interesting discussion sitting together in the living room. There were like 40 people attending this session. And the father basically was heartbroken. He said, look, I raised my kids to be great Zionists and to love Israel and to defend Israel. And I don't understand where did I went wrong, because it was very clear that the son is a very harsh criticism on Israel. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the whole conversation, which was very challenging and emotional. When it was over, just before I left, I saw the father in the kitchen alone. And I went to him and I said, like, look, I just want to tell you one thing. You didn't do anything wrong. You actually did the right thing. You raised your kids in the right way. You gave them the right values and moral values. But actually what happened to you, like to many other American Jewry, is that American Jewry, to a large extent, unfortunately, was kidnapped from within. Now, I have to explain what does it mean, kidnapped from within? What's the story of that? There are basically two major factors that are involved in this phenomenon where American Jewry were kidnapped from within. One is the fact that the core values of American Jewry, Tikkun Olam, social justice, the language, the terminology, were basically kidnapped and turned against American Jewry in a very cynical way. Let me give you an example so we could understand what do I mean by I'm saying very cynical way. When you look at the terminology used by BDS organizations in the state, you will find an amazing resemblance to the terminology of Tikkun Olam and social justice. You see here, for example, these are all quotes taken from the mission statements of organizations like Free Palestine Movement. And it says, to defend and advocate for the human rights of all Palestinians. Or you could see the BDS mission statements that says, BDS allows people of conscience to play an effective role in the Palestinian struggle for justice. These are all terms and terminology that are taken straight from the Jewish vocabulary, and particularly the Tikkun Olam and social justice. Here is another interesting example. Students for Justice in Palestine, to promote the cause of justice and speak out against oppression. Keep in mind what Elie Wiesel once said, there may be times where we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. The best way I can illustrate how those terminology was actually taken and turned against American Jews in a very cynical and sophisticated way is just to bring things from the people who basically represent that. So I would like to share with you this short video. It's about 1 minute video, and I think it speaks for itself.
Jewish day school, I was taught that what it meant to be Jewish was to unconditionally support Israel. And so many of people in my generation were taught the same thing. And what we're saying here today is that not only is it a moral imperative to fight for ourselves, to fight anti-Semitism here in the US, but it's also a moral imperative to fight for the freedom of Palestinians, and that's actually core to the Jewish tradition. If I'm only for myself, what am I? That actually only being for our own community's dignity and survival is actually makes us into like less than human. And we're seeing that happen in so much of our community, where they trade their own humanity because they're afraid of what it might mean to give Palestinians just basic dignity and freedom.
So I hope that you saw this example, and I think that it speaks for itself very clearly.
And so many of people in my generation were taught the same thing. And what we're saying here today is that not only is it a moral imperative to fight for ourselves, to fight anti-Semitism here in the US, but it's also a moral imperative to fight.
Just close the tab. All set, perfect.
Excellent. So I hope that you could see it now. Can you see the presentation? Good.
Yes, you're good to go.
Excellent. So I think that this statement, as I said before, manifests exactly what I said earlier, how this language, terminology, great values were very cynically and sophisticatedly turned against American Jewry. It became a double-edged sword impacting American Jewry. But that for itself was not enough to create this impact, this negative, damage, harmful impact on American Jewry. There was another factor that coincided with that. And the other factor that coincided with that was what is called the truth decay, a systematic flow, a truth decay. Now, I want to share with you here a short story to explain to you what you see right in front of you. In the summer of 2014, I was briefing a group of students in Israel during the war, and we were standing on a hill overlooking the airport, the Ben Gurion International Airport. You may remember the airport was closed for a while because of the rockets flying in from Gaza. So we were standing there and we saw how the incoming planes were diverting the course because it was too dangerous to directly land in the airport. The students were from the States. Some of them were not from the States. They were all students for a law program in the States. Some of them were from different places. And while all the students, most of the students easily understood my explanation, there was one particular student that was clearly a Jewish who basically was unwilling to accept the facts that I was presenting. He was unwilling to look at reality for what it was. It was very clear to me that in a way, he's experiencing some sort of an inner dilemma that forces him almost to airbrush reality. He just couldn't understand or wouldn't be willing to accept what he's looking at the reality. There was clearly some inner struggle. That for me was a very significant milestone because that was the aha moment. That was the moment where finally I understood one of the major challenges that Israel advocacy has to deal with. You know, there are many groups of Israel advocacy, many organizations. They are doing wonderful work. They are working very hard. It's a major challenge. And if I may add my observation, one of the major challenges, if not the most significant one, is this airbrushing of reality. Because in the end of the day, there is no lack of information and figures and statistics and facts that are provided. Just the same, time and again, we learn that unfortunately, for some reason, all of this information, all of those facts and so on, are actually not reaching to the target. The people are not willing to be receptive to accept it. And it's basically a reflection of this airbrushing that I was describing to you. The combination of these two things actually resulted in some wide and deep damage. And if I may quote, let me quote here a report that was done by the Rand Institute in 2018, which actually is the, I call it the bitter fruits of the combination of narratives and airbrushing of reality. And this is a quote from the report. Crisis of critical thinking, severe and dangerous, a threat to policy making and democracy. Unless action is taken to restore trust in and respect for facts, data, and analysis, much of the basis for the internal stability and prosperity of the United States could be at risk. I would say that this is very valid and accurate observation, and if I may add, I think that we see to a large extent that impact not only in the context of American Jewry, but also in the context of the United States and particularly these very days. However, going back to American Jewry, the combination of this sophisticated, cynical manipulation of the language of Tikkun Olam and social justice, together with the age of narratives, the age where facts are irrelevant, sequence of event is spared, context is totally unnecessary, and reality is basically airbrushed. That combination results in a very harmful impact on American Jewish community. It increases criticism of Israel and threatens the American Jewish community, creates an increasingly polarized conversation about Israel, damages the connection between American Jewry and Israel, compromises the fabric of the Jewish community. I believe these are all aspects that we are, and you are particularly, unfortunately, quite aware of. So, once understanding these factors that create that challenge, now, of course, is the time to ask, okay, what can be done? Can we do something to address that effectively, productively? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, very decisively, because this is what I've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years. And the outlook, the praxis, the approach that I'm going to share with you is not an academic theory. It is based upon proven record of success of working many years with both Jewish and non-Jewish audience. Inside the Middle East, Intelligence Perspective, my program that we have launched a couple of years ago in the States, basically it's a practice that offers a new framework for discussion that effectively addresses this challenge. Now, before moving in and understanding how that praxis address effectively and productively that challenge, let me start with one simple basic observation. Do not fight narrative with narrative. I know it's almost counterintuitive, but let me explain to you shortly why not. There are 2 reasons why not. One, in the psyche, the emotional, intellectual atmosphere that I described earlier, meaning in the landscape where facts are irrelevant, context is irrelevant, reality is airbrushed, reality is subdued to feelings, emotions, and narratives. In such an environment, Israel narrative stands no chance in comparison to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the ones that are viewed as the underdog, as the victims. It doesn't matter what you say, it will not be powerful enough to overcast the way that the young generation and others are looking at the Palestinian status of victims. So this is one reason. The other reason why not to fight narrative with narrative is because when you do that, you actually come across as someone who doesn't really have real tools to address the questions and the criticism. In other words, you are trapping yourself in a niche where basically you are losing, not winning. And that is, of course, not what we want to do. So do not fight narrative with narrative. Now, what can and should be done? As I said before, Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspective, this is ITME, provides an apolitical, non-partisan Middle East education and uses intelligence methodology to teach critical thinking and media literacy. Obviously, we have to ask ourselves, fine, that is very interesting. How exactly does it address effectively and constructively the challenge that we are dealing with? This is a valid and important question. Let us understand how. Once again, I want to share with you a story, this time about a place called the Gaza Strip. Notice that I'm deliberately taking something that is definitely one of, if not the most sensitive issue that fuels this friction and debates within American Jewry, the story of Gaza Strip. I'm doing a lot of briefings about Gaza Strip, either abroad and particularly in Israel. I'm briefing all kinds of audiences. One of the most interesting groups I'm briefing time and again are students. And within that group, interesting enough, I've been asked time and again by students that are coming from campuses in the state that are rather known as to be very progressive or liberal, who ask to meet with me with their delegations visiting, their fact-finding delegations visiting Israel. They ask specifically to meet with me to talk about the issue of Gaza Strip. The reason they do that is not because I'm echoing their narratives, and obviously not because I'm echoing the Israel advocacy narratives. They are doing that because of a different reason. When I'm talking about the story of Gaza Strip, what I'm actually doing is I'm putting the story of Gaza Strip in the context of what is going on in the Middle East. In other words, I'm sharing with my audience how the Middle East reality shapes the reality of the Gaza Strip. How, in the end of the day, issues that seemingly have nothing to do with Gaza Strip, like, for example, the hegemonic vision of Iran, the hegemonic vision of Turkey, the power struggle between Islamist and civil society in Arab worlds, and other issues that seemingly have nothing to do with Gaza Strip are actually have everything to do with Gaza Strip. And they are shaping Gaza Strip story, and as an outcome of that, they are shaping also the story of Israel and Gaza Strip relationship. This is a perspective that 99% of the cases, and I'm talking here about hundreds of briefings that I gave, the audience are totally unaware of. Once I'm presenting that perspective, explaining how the Middle East impacts the reality in Gaza, I refer to the situation in Gaza. I do acknowledge the fact that the situation in Gaza is challenging. I'm saying to my audience, look, I wouldn't like to live in Gaza. People are not dying in Gaza because they don't have medicines or water or electricity, but just the same, everyday conditions in Gaza Strip are very stressful. I acknowledge that, yet I put it in the right context and in the right proportion. And then what I'm doing, I'm bringing a new element to the story of Gaza Strip. Instead of sinking in the niche of narratives, oh yeah, they shoot rockets, or Israel is the poor one, and the other way around, I don't go to that niche. But what I bring is, I bring a new element to the discussion. I'm actually creating a new angle for the discussion. And in the case of Gaza Strip, I'm doing something very simple and very powerful. I bring into the story the concept of governmental accountability. And I say to the audience, students, diplomats, policymakers, media people, I'm saying to them, look, Gaza Strip is ruled by Hamas since 2007. Hamas has government. It employs 50,000 officials. It has military forces of dozens of thousands of people who they pay salary. Hamas legislates laws. Hamas has courts, prisons. He set the curriculum at high schools and so on. Would you agree that Hamas is a government? And the answer is always the same. Yes, Hamas is a government. My next question is, do you think a government has a partial accountability and responsibility? Do you think that government is responsible only for your collecting your garbage and taking care of your education, but not taking care of your healthcare? The answer, of course, is no. A government is a full 100% accountability and responsibility. From that point, I could make a very significant change, because from that point, and believe me, I've never ever came across anyone who pushed back on that. I can say to people, look, we all share the idea that we want to make change. We want to positively impact reality. We want to offer a future for the people of Gaza, for humanitarian needs. We want to offer a future for the people of Israel. We are coming from a good place. But does it occur to you that, in fact, by exempting Hamas from responsibility, as unfortunately is being done quite often by Western circles, you are actually perpetuating the situation? Because if you exempt Hamas from responsibility of government, as a government, how can you expect that things will be improved in Gaza Strip? This line of presentation that provides the wide context, the Middle East and the impact on Hamas and Gaza Strip, that acknowledge the situation in Gaza Strip and does not negate the challenges of Gaza Strip. That line that actually brings a new discussion, a totally new discussion, that in the end of the day, about governmental responsibility, that in the end of the day directly connects to the idea of we want to make a positive impact. And in order to do that, we do have to apply the rule of governmental responsibility. When I apply that approach, and I do that all the time, and I get all the time the same reaction. What is the reaction that I get exactly? You may wonder. I provide professional, apolitical, contextualized knowledge. I insert critical thinking. How much do we know? Where do I get my information from? And I create a new focus for the discussion, as I said before, the governmental accountability. What I'm doing here is actually I'm positioning myself as a reliable, professional, non-biased source of knowledge. So the listeners don't feel they need to push back at me, which is very significant, because it's not falling into the category of Israel advocacy, of a narrative versus narrative. It's a totally different ballgame. When I apply that approach, notice what actually I'm resulting. I'm changing the lenses. Now the audience says, oh, this is a complex story, and that counters the simplistic narratives. I need to expand knowledge, and that counters the truth decay. I need to apply critical thinking, meaning I draw my own conclusion myself, based upon my inquiry and studying and so on. The outcome of that is that actually what I generate is willingness of the audience to be receptive to Israel needs without inner conflict. This is the critical component. I don't expect my audience, either if they are Jewish students or no, or whoever the audience is, to walk away waving the flag of Israel. But if I know, and it happens all the time, that I generate a willingness to be more receptive to Israel's need without inner conflict, meaning that the audience, the client, sort of speaking, doesn't feel that by doing that he or she compromise his or her inner beliefs, this is how the change is being made. And again, let me reemphasize that. It is based upon many, many, many briefings I did for the last years. How about the impact of ITME, the curriculum and the praxis in the context of American Jewish community? What it does, it provides many advantages. It provides platform for constructive and productive conversation, inclusive of all views. Because it's not anymore about the narratives and the feelings, it's about understanding the Middle East, understanding how it impacts Israel reality, based upon professional knowledge. It provides better understanding of Israel's challenged positions and needs because we understand the region and how it impacts. That enables people to feel comfortable to identify with Israel, not necessarily from a place of a blind obligation or loyalty, quote unquote, but from a place for understanding the complex reality and how it shapes and dictates sometimes Israel's positions and acts. It makes people more resilient to anti-Israel arguments and narratives. Again, from a place that is not about narratives versus narrative, but from a place that is much more solid based upon understanding of the complexity of the reality. It is effective use of core Jewish values for positive, sustainable change. When I'm standing with young American Jews who are motivated and inspired by the wonderful, beautiful ideas of tikkun olam and social justice, of compassion, of taking care of the other, of humanity, all the wonderful values. And I actually saying to them, look, if you understand the complexity of the reality, if you absorb, internalize the concept of governmental accountability, basically what happens is that you have a better chance to enhance all the beautiful ideas that you're standing for in comparison to just putting the blame or just criticizing Israel and actually exempting the Palestinians from responsibility. And this is a very significant change in the mindset. It makes Israel a uniting and non-dividing factor. It contributes to a critical thinking, media literate, intelligence mindset, which is very much needed, as we all know. And it's productively understand and responds to a complicated global reality. How does it help American Jewry? It is an antidote to simplistic narratives, platform for constructive and productive conversation, counter anti-Israel arguments not out of blind obligation, effective use of core Jewish values, and reconnect tikkun olam and social justice with Israel. In other words, one of the major challenges is that, like this young, wonderful woman that is coming with wonderful values, actually says, for me, humanity has to do with tikkun olam and social justice. And if Israel is viewed as inhuman or acting in an inhuman way, I disconnect tikkun olam and social justice from Israel. What we are doing here is we are reconnecting. In other words, we are making Israel a very significant, once again, component in the identity of American Jews in that sense. ITME offers new lenses and new framework for constructive, apolitical, respectful discussion, which is very much needed, as we all know. I've been working with different communities and leadership that are coming from different walks of life. J Street, AIPAC, conservatives, Haredis, liberals, and so on, reforms. That platform enables these people to finally have a constructive discussion rather than a food fight. This is, of course, strengthening the fabric of American Jewry. It reaffirms and robust and sustainable connections to Israel and ensure Israel's place as a unifying entity for the American Jewish community. It's not to say that there shouldn't be criticism or that criticism should be negated. No, not at all. Criticism is always welcome and needed, but it basically makes this distinction between this criticism that is constructive, that is in the end of the day aimed to bring all of us together around, and criticism that is basically destructive and non-productive. And finally, just shortly, the audience, the target audience of the ITME program is, as you could see, varied national and communal Jewish organizations, lay leadership, professional leadership, students, undergraduate students, high school students, 11th and 12th grades, and finally intergenerational. As you could see, there are lots of groups that we can work with and apply that approach and the method of the ITME. And as I said before, what I'm sharing with you is based upon an accumulative practical experience of at least 6 or 7 years working with all kind of audience, both Jews and non-Jews alike. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude my presentation and opening this session for questions.
Well, thank you, Avi. That was a very interesting presentation about your ITME approach, and I'm sure it got lots of folks thinking. We also have some questions that are sort of holdovers from last week's presentation on what's going on with the possibility of possible annexation of regions of the West Bank. So we may want to go back to some questions around that, and folks may have other questions in terms of what's going on in the Middle East, as your neighborhood has always got plenty for us to consider. But I wanted to represent a question that we had just now, which was this. The question came in saying that one of the things that we hear from many young Jews are, why has the occupation of the West Bank lasted until now, and what have Israeli governments done to end this occupation? And then the second follow-up to that was, given the increasingly rightward turn within Israel, is there any chance for genuine Israeli-Palestinian coexistence?
Okay, these are two big questions. I'll try to address them efficiently and shortly. Regarding the first question, I'm always saying to people that I'm talking about the story of the Israeli-Palestinian, I'm saying, look, I have a very simple method. I don't deal with the game of blame. I find both Israelis and Palestinians responsible for the gloomy situation. It's not a one-side story. The bottom line is that the two people, as a fact, are not in a place where they can really get together around the table and really do the process required to achieve, I wouldn't even say a peace, but to achieve an arrangement, a solution that is sustainable for a long period of time. And I want to reiterate again, Israel holds responsibility for that. The Palestinians also are responsible for that. And that's the bottom line. In other words, what we are looking at is a story of a conflict where the two sides have yet not gone through the process required to take them to the place where they could sit and make an arrangement. What is required to do that? First and foremost, it requires to be able to compromise some of your most dearest and deepest narratives and beliefs. And again, the Palestinians have deepest and dearest narratives and beliefs. Israelis have deepest and dearest narratives and beliefs. None of the sides was really able to overcome, to compromise, to say, I know that in order to generate a process of reconciliation, I know that I have to compromise my belief and to give up some of my dreams. The two sides were not unable to do that. And that's the reason I've been saying 25 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 5 years ago, and today, and I will continue to say that. Peace between Israel and the Palestinians is not an achievable goal, not because I don't want peace. It's because the two people are in a place they can't really have peace. What can be tried to achieve are arrangements on the ground that could be sustained and endured as long as possible. They probably will need to be adjusted. That is and I emphasize, that is practically the best we can achieve at this point. It's not ideally, but between trying to achieve ideal that cannot be achieved today, as I explained before, and trying to achieve an arrangement that perhaps lay the foundation for the next step of arrangement. Doing this distinction is very significant if somebody wants to really contribute effectively and constructively to that story.
Okay, and do you want to address the comment about the rightward leaning of the government?
The Israeli society and politics, to a large extent, is centered to the right, I would say. Now, there are the more far right wing that is basically obviously very dogmatic and tough. But actually, when you look at the Israeli society, the fabric of Israeli society and the Israeli politics, you find out in the end of the day that the major players in the Israeli politics are, in the end of the day, they don't have such a big differences in the way they view the context of the course of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most of the Israelis, to the best of my impression and observation, actually seek to separate from the Palestinians. Most of the Israelis are looking for a two-state solution where the Palestinians will have their own state and Israel will be a separate entity. Most of the Israelis do not support the idea of annexation or a full annexation of Israel over the Palestinians. Again, it may surprise you to know, but most of the settlements in the West Bank were established by governments that were labor governments, and even with a leftist, in a way, affiliation. There are lots of surprises within Israeli politics. So the issue of right-wing affiliation has to be examined much more closely. And I think that when you examine it closely, you see a little bit different picture than what it perceives to be.
So following up on those two comments, and we've had some other questions in some other areas, but just as the conversation is flowing, there's been a couple of questions about Peter Beinart's article about the death of the two-state solution. And I guess folks are wondering, is it possible that that's in our future or not? And what your sense is, given what you just said about the majority of Israelis' desire to see that happen.
Well, as I said, majority of the Israelis do not support the concept of one state solution. Majority of the Israelis basically seeks to separate from the Palestinians. You want to call it two states or whatever. The issue of one state, to a large extent, to the best of my evaluation, when I look at the factors on the ground on both sides, and particularly in that context, the Palestinian side, that concept is a recipe for a disaster. It will not bring any good things to the people. It's a recipe for disaster.
Thank you. So circling back to your presentation on ITME, some folks are interested in knowing, how can they become more involved in adopting that approach and how they can go about using it to teach, especially locally here in the United States with high school students, and wanting to know through your 7 years of practice with this, if you've accumulated any data in terms of its effectiveness.
Yes, let me start with the second part of the question. We've been doing this program for students in liberal college in the States. We've been doing that for senior advisors of congressmen and senators. We've been doing that for Jewish leadership, lay leadership, and professional leadership. We always do pre and post evaluations, professional. Our pre and post evaluation presents a very decisively fact. We shift the needle. We shift the needle in the sense, not in the sense that people walk away waving flags, Israel, rah, 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 but in the sense that people walk away and say, we understand now it's a much more complex reality. It's nothing like the shallow narrative that we are exposed to in the Western media. And out of that understanding of the Middle East, there is a growing willingness to understand and to be willing to be receptive to Israel's positions and needs. So the second part of the question, the answer is very simple. Based upon 7 years of experience, and we are talking here working with a variety of audience, we know, based upon our professional evaluation, that we shift the needle exactly the way we anticipate to shift the needle. Going back to the first part of your question, I will be more than happy to explore possibilities to provide the knowledge, the experience, the practical tools and skills that ITME offers to people in the community, to lay leadership, to high schools, to professional leadership, to organizations, anything that will help in effectively and productively addressing that challenge. And I can tell you, based upon, again, our experience and our wonderful recommendations and testimonials, that it is working. It does make this change.
Thank you. So if we go back 2 weeks in time to your last conversation, we were anticipating that possibly on July 1st, something was going to change in terms of the status of communities in the West Bank. And we see that that's been pushed out a little bit. It seems as if, a day in the Middle East is like a year in other places, and things happen very, very dramatically. And we've also seen in the press reports that there have been several explosions reported in the nuclear complexes in Iran. So I'm just curious if you see that annexation has been pushed much further down the road, and what your sense is of what's happening currently on the ground or under the ground in Iran right now in terms of how that might play out in the region.
Okay, so let's start with annexation. You may remember that when we talked about it, I said if the annexation is taking place, and that was of course a big if. As of now, that skepticism was accurate, meaning nothing really happened as of now. I still stick to my basic evaluations, meaning if there is going to be an Israeli move, it's going to be minimal. It's not going to be dramatic in the sense of like taking over 30% of their land. I think that, again, we probably, if it's going to happen, see something like along the lines of the story of Ma'ale Adumim that I was talking about, or maybe another Israeli settlement that falls to the same category of consensus settlements. The bottom line, I don't see, like I said 2 weeks ago, I don't see something really dramatic happening in the sense of like what's the scale of Israel moves on that. And along and parallel to that, obviously, we may remember we talked about potential reactions of the Palestinians, potential reactions of the Arab world. All of the evaluations that I made back 2 weeks ago are still valid, and I continue to stick to this evaluation. Regarding to the story of Iran, there has been recently a series of strange incidents in Iran. You mentioned one of them, the explosion at the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran. Some of those events, there has been different events, some of those events has been attributed to Israel by different factors, but I must emphasize that the Iranians didn't formally directly said it is Israel or it is the United States. There has been all kind of like back channel, vague statements made by formal spokespersons of the Iranians. They, as of now, they avoid from blaming Israel or the United States openly and directly in the events that happened there. I don't know, of course, to say the ins and outs of the events that happened there. According, as you probably know, according to different reports, some of those incidents are the outcome of some sort of a deliberate sabotage. Some are talking about it in the context of cyber attacks. Some are talking about it in the context of some inner job done by local factors on the ground. One way or another, in the context of the Iranians, the bottom line is that particularly the story of the Natanz, according to estimations, delays significantly the Iranian trajectory towards developing a nuclear military capacities. One way or another, I think the challenge remains in large the same challenge. I mean, we are looking at a regime which is an enormously dangerous regime, threatening the whole region and particularly, of course, Israel. And unfortunately, as a fact, we know that all the attempts to outreach that regime and to dialogue with that regime actually ended up with mostly one outcome, and that is that the regime was boosting its aggression on the ground. Following the signing of the 2015 JCPOA agreement, the Iranian deal, following the signing of the agreement with the Western powers and the United States, back then President Obama's administration, unfortunately, the regime boosted its aggression in the region, in the Gulf area, in the Red Sea, in Syria, including directly attacking Israel. Meanwhile, in parallel to that, the challenges in Iran are increasing, and particularly following the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the JCPOA, Iran is struggling major economic hardship. There is a growing discontent in Iran. To that, we have to add the impact of coronavirus. According to the Iranians' official authorities, the death toll in Iran as of now is more than 12,000 people. However, Iranian opposition sources constantly argue that the death toll has exceeded more than 50,000 people. I do not have the ability to confirm that number, but I would definitely say that I don't believe that the number provided by the authorities is the real number. One last thing in the context of Iran, interesting, should be followed. This month, on July 17th, there is a global initiative initiated by Iranian opposition, Freedom for Iran. It's supposed to be one day across the globe where people from different backgrounds are actually coming around together to demand freedom for the Iranian people who are basically deserves that freedom. Unfortunately, my observation was still valid and is that the Iranian people will have to fight for their freedom, and they will have to buy their freedom with their blood. The Iranian mullah regime will not go down quietly. It holds Iran in an iron fist. It demonstrated a couple of times in 2009, in 2019, in 2020. He has no moral restrictions, and he basically butchers people who dare to outcry. So the bottom line is that the Iranian regime continue its iron grip on Iran. the Iranian people, and the Iranian people will have to fight literally for their freedom.
Okay, so our time is drawing a little short. I want to get in at least one more question. And so we had this one, which is a little bit of a departure from where we just were, which is that you touched on the context of disbelief in facts, such as fake news. And the question is, how do you overcome the willingness to just dismiss facts as false or irrelevant?
Could you just reiterate the question? I want to make sure that I understood it.
So you talked about fake news or you know, playing with the truth, and the question is, how do you overcome that in you know, in practice?
The way to overcome that is to do two major things. To insert a critical thinking mindset and to provide people with tools that are based upon intelligence work and mindset, user-friendly tools, simply to apply, that help people to do sort of an preliminary, immediate evaluation of the reliability of the information they come across. This is exactly what Inside the Middle East program is doing. Inside the Middle East program is providing people with the mindset, the way of thinking. How do you look suspiciously at information, and what kind of tools you can apply, simple but very effective tool that will help you to identify whether it is a false or fake news or a reliable news. This is one of the major components or one of the major pillars of the Inside the Middle East program, and this is what we are teaching people to do. And as you could understand, and particularly in our times, and it's going to become more and more critical and crucial, such approach, such tools, such mindset is going to become more and more crucial for people. And in that sense, this is the advantage and the contribution of Inside the Middle East. You see, the major challenge we are facing today is not lack of information. It is the overwhelming amount of information that we are exposed to. And there is a need to provide people with the ability to navigate the way effectively through this endless ocean of information that we are just engulfed with.
So thank you, Avi. I see that my colleague Steve Raub from the JCRC of Greater Hartford is ready to say thank you, but I'm going to offer my personal thanks and thanks of our community here in Greater New Haven. You're always, your insights are always very, very helpful for us to understanding the changing facts on the ground, and we look forward to hearing more in 2 weeks. So take it away, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Avi, and thank you, Judy, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm Steve Raub, Chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC, of Greater Hartford. And one of the many objectives of the JCRC is to enhance understanding of Israel and its relationship to American Jews and its neighbors in the Middle East. It's been a treat to learn from Avi again today, and we look forward to welcoming him back 2 weeks from now for the final Lunch and Learn in the series. Avi will give us an update on and analysis of current events across the Middle East and how they impact Israel. Please mark your calendars for July 27th at noon. We hope to see you there. Until then, thanks again and stay well.
Thank you so much. Shalom from Israel.